Senses. The senses are the way human beings receive information from outside or inside the body. There are 7 senses, including the 5 children usually learn about in school. These each have a common name and a scientific name, which we show here in brackets. Hearing, auditory; sight, visual; smell, olfactory; taste, gustatory; and touch, tactile, which includes light touch, deep pressure touch, temperature, and pain. There are 2 other very important senses that are less well known, so they don't really have agreed upon common names and are usually called by their scientific names. These are the vestibular sense and proprioception, or the proprioceptive sense. Please watch the section of the video called A Review of the 7 Senses for more information about both of these important senses. Sensors. Each sense has specialized neuroreceptors, or sensors, that send information to the central nervous system. The taste buds are one example of sensors. For many of the senses, such as taste, sight, and hearing, the sensors are all centered in one location. This is called a sense organ. The eyes, the nose, and the tongue are all examples of sense organs. Sensory processing. Sensory processing is a name for the neurological process by which our brains receive, organize, and interpret information from all of our senses. This process can also be called sensory integration. Sensory integration has 2 definitions. It is a name for the neurological process by which we receive, organize, and interpret information from our senses, also called sensory processing. Sensory integration is also the name for a specific form of occupational therapy treatment, which requires certain training and certification and uses proprietary treatment techniques. The concept of sensory integration was introduced in the 1960s by occupational therapist Jean Ayres, a pioneer in the understanding and treatment of children with sensory processing challenges, or, to use the term she coined, sensory integrative dysfunction. Over the years, the language has evolved, and the terms sensory processing and sensory integration are both used to describe the neurological process by which we receive, organize, interpret, and use the information from the sensory environment. Sensory integrative dysfunction is now usually called sensory processing disorder. To try to keep things simple, in most of this video we use the term sensory processing instead of sensory integration when talking about the theory. That is the process by which we take in, process and interpret, and use sensory information. Sensory registration is the first step of sensory processing. Sensory information from the environment is registered, that is noticed or detected, by the senses. In order for a sensation to be registered, it has to cross the sensory threshold. The sensory threshold is a level at which sensation is registered. Every person has a unique point or threshold at which we detect or notice sensory information. Sensory information cannot be registered until it has crossed the sensory threshold. If a person has a high threshold for a certain sensation, it takes a lot of that sensation before they notice or register it. Therefore, a person with a high threshold is under-responsive to that type of sensory input. Children with high thresholds for a particular sensation may seek out and want a lot of that sensation. If a person has a low threshold for a certain sensation, it means that they notice that sensation with very little input. We would say that these people are over-responsive. Children with low thresholds for a particular sensation may avoid or not want any of that sensation. Children with sensory processing challenges often have sensory thresholds that are unusually high or unusually low, or sometimes both. Everyone's sensory thresholds are unique and may be different for different sensations, and sensory thresholds can change depending on how awake or alert you are, what you've been doing, your mood, and other factors. Your sensory thresholds can affect how you react to the behavior of children with sensory processing challenges or any child. For example, if you have a low threshold for sound at the end of your day, you're more likely to react negatively to a child who is very noisy after school than if you have a high threshold for sound. Sensory preference. Everyone's sensory system is unique. Because of this, everyone has sensory preferences. That is, there are certain sensations that we like and other sensations that we might prefer to avoid. Sensory preferences include how much or the intensity of different sensations we can either enjoy or tolerate. Our sensory preferences affect the food we like to eat, how we sleep, our reactions to different environments, whether we like to climb trees or ride roller coasters, all sorts of things. When someone has a very strong sensory dislike to the point that they're not able to tolerate that sensation at all, it is called a sensory aversion. Sensory aversion. A sensory aversion is a fixed, intense dislike for or an inability to tolerate a certain sensory experience. Occupational therapist. Just what is an occupational therapist? It often surprises people to hear that their child is being referred to occupational therapy, as the word occupational makes a lot of people think about jobs or working. Don't worry, we won't make your preschooler go out and get a job. Occupation can mean a job or profession, but it also means any way of spending time. Typical occupations of children include getting dressed, eating and feeding themselves, playing, learning new things, and interacting with family members and friends. Occupational therapists, or OTs for short, are rehabilitation and health professionals whose job it is to help people to do all of the occupations or activities that they want, need, or are expected to be able to do. Sensory processing differences can affect a child's ability to take part in just about any occupation or activity, which is why sensory processing assessment and intervention has become such an important part of pediatric OT practice. Occupational therapists are client-centered. They will work with you to meet the goals that you have for your child and your family. OTs may use a variety of methods in working with children with sensory processing challenges, but they will always begin by finding out what your goals are for your child and will work with you to meet those goals.